Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Compulang podcast. My name is Jacob, and this is the episode for the 7th of December, 2020. I am joined today by my good friend Troy.
Howdy.
And let's take a look at some of the stories we have today. So, if you remember back from a couple episodes ago, we were talking about the Coalition for App Fairness, which is a couple of companies that got together and they essentially wanted Apple to reduce the commission that they took out of transactions from the App Store from 30% to, well, they just wanted them to reduce it. I don't think they gave a specific number, but it was a couple of companies all together, like Spotify and Proton Mail, and I think Epic Games might have been involved as well. And from the looks of it, so a story came out a couple days ago, maybe even just over a week ago, looks like, from the Next Web. There's also an announcement from Apple.com, and they're going to be lowering their app, well, it was called an app tax by the Coalition for App Fairness, but it's their commission that they take from transactions. They're lowering it from 30% to 15% for small businesses, which is less than $1 million of proceeds in a year is their definition there. So, would you consider this a win for the Coalition for App Fairness, Troy?
Well, it's certainly ground made, I suppose. Though, to be fair, the Coalition for App Fairness is made up of a bunch of companies that would not qualify for this cut.
Yeah.
So, it's a bit like, yay. Honestly, I have this wild theory that Apple is galaxy braining this right now because so there's these companies, right, which people, there's kind of this anti-consumerism, anti-capitalism like vibe going on right now,
Yeah, a little bit.
with a lot of people, but you know, these companies have come together and they've created this movement I think a lot of people agree with, at least on the surface. And Apple giving the little guy this cut might draw away any like active or a lot of active support for the coalition moving forward, right? Because it's like, well, they got what they wanted, so they have no more stakes anymore.
Yeah. So it will be interesting to see because, yeah, Apple like galaxy braining it or something like that, because obviously all these companies were trying to be like, oh my goodness, Apple's being such a monopoly, you know, we're just these poor little companies, you know, just trying to make our way. And here these are obviously some of the biggest apps on the App Store, right? Like Spotify is freaking huge. But then Apple comes back with this and they're like, yeah, we'll reduce it by half if you make less than $1 million, which is going to take all of,
all the popular
not
support
many
away. Yeah,
I don't see very many like indie app developers making over $1 million, right? And definitely not. That's not going to make up the majority of the, you know, civilian support for the Coalition for App Fairness.
Yeah, I do appreciate the move, though. I do appreciate the cut for small businesses because I think that's important to get them off the ground.
Oh, definitely. I wonder if Google's going to hit back with something different, or with something similar, rather, because obviously now Apple is going to kind of have a little edge there in the market for apps that make less than
that was
$1
one thing I noticed, because looking at the Coalition for App Fairness's website, they're all like Apple, Apple, Apple. And they even say, if consumers want to use a modern mobile device, Apple levies a tax that no one can avoid. No competition, no options, no recourse. Right? And, wait, was that the thing I was looking at? Oh, no, Apple takes 30% of the purchase price. No other transaction fee in any industry comes close. Doesn't Google take 30%?
Yes.
In their app store? Yeah, exactly. So
which is literally their direct competitor.
Yeah.
And they're trying to paint Apple as this sort of like huge monopoly, and here Android has like 70% plus of the mobile device market. So they kind of seem to be like aiming in the wrong direction, if you ask me.
Yeah, they're kind of picking on Apple for, I mean, maybe there's a personal grudge in there somewhere, but yeah, it seems like, I don't know if they're trying to like make things like more clear for people by having just like one enemy instead of two or something. That could be
Yeah,
it.
I
But
suppose everyone's
it
kind
seems
of.
like they should be attacking Google too, because Google has the. I mean, that quote right there that I just said is just blatantly wrong, because Google also
Yeah.
commissions 30%.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
And
I
not
think.
only are they a direct competitor, they are the largest competitor in the market. You're kind of overlooking 70% or so of the market there.
Yeah, I am curious to see if Google retaliates, because their current strategy has been, well, we allow third-party app stores on our devices, right? So we allow competition on our devices, and so we don't need to, cut down on our commission.
Yeah, I know I have a third-party app store installed, but the amount of apps that I have installed from that third-party app store is about like 2. So
Yeah.
it's still, if not a complete monopoly, effectively a monopoly, or very closely to, like, as far as like which app store gets all the traffic. It's like
Yeah, I mean, it's all about looking good on paper,
oh, of course,
right? Because I
definitely.
mean,
No doubt about that.
it, like a lot of the, or like an article that we'll be talking about later, a lot of people don't care about this a whole lot. They just don't think about it. They're like, oh yeah, I'll just drink the Apple Kool-Aid or the Google Kool-Aid and live
Yeah.
live my life.
Well, Apple protects my privacy. Wink, wink. All right. Well, that was Apple cutting its App Store commission from 30% to 15%. And let's move on just a bit to our next story from the BBC. As always, links in either the description or the show notes, depending on where you're listening to this. And we have this story from the BBC so the UK has approved the Pfizer vaccine for COVID-19. Still in the middle of a pandemic over here. And the Australian airline Qantas. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. Is it Qantas or Qantas?
No clue.
Proposed a immunization passport. Article didn't get too much into the dirty details, but pretty much the idea is that you would have something to like verify that you have been immunized against COVID-19 or something, and then without that evidence, they wouldn't allow you on their airline. Obviously, this is not implemented yet. They've just proposed this. Troy, what do you think the privacy implications are for something like an immunization passport?
Yeah, well, it really depends on what form it takes, because there's been a lot of propositions out there for something similar like this. Digital, non-digital, whatever, and it is a question of health record security and how much you put out there, because at one part, in this article, somebody suggested having all of your vaccines listed out in some app or something, so you just have them all there and you know when they expire, which like sounds good, right? But convenience always comes at the cost of security.
Of course,
right? As is the old adage, and so there's definitely a concern. I think if it's just limited to if you have the vaccine or not, I'm not sure how much of like your privacy that gets into. Besides, like the other fact, or the other kind of major problem with this is the worry that there's going to be, I hesitate to say like discrimination, but just like unequal impacts on certain groups. The article says disproportionate impact on some groups, because we know that some groups of people have been more severely impacted by this pandemic, right? And most certainly the vaccine is going to go to certain groups of people at a higher rate than others, right? Because of access, because of any types of priority, things like that. And so that is another main concern, is how it will have these disproportionate impacts.
Yeah. I'm just thinking back to when I used to work at a software company that made software that was used in the medical field. And one of our big concerns is this law in the US called HIPAA. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but essentially it's like health information privacy. Actually, that might be what it stands for. But like your personally identifiable health information has to be secured according to this law. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know the dirty details of this law, but I know for a fact that something like your vaccination records is definitely not something that we can just throw around willy-nilly. That's definitely something that needs to be protected. That's personal health information. And if you just now all of a sudden you have that on your phone and you have to show that to like random people to get on an airplane, that just seems to me like an unnecessary like divulging of your personal health information. Now, admittedly, they could do something like, okay, so instead of saying, yeah, okay, you have the COVID vaccine, you have the polio vaccine, you have your whatever vaccine, you got your flu vaccine this year. Good job. We'll allow you on board the plane. Instead of saying something like that, they might just say like, okay, here's like a QR code, and it'll just hit an API that says eligible or ineligible or something like that.
Yeah.
But it's still you're still going to have to upload your there's going to be even more parties along the line that have access to this information now, and it just doesn't seem entirely necessary to me. And like you have been saying over multiple podcast episodes now, convenience always comes at the expense of security, and this is or privacy, and this is definitely one of those cases.
Definitely.
Yeah. All right. So we have an airline trying to propose an immunization passport, and that's not necessarily so cool. But then we have this fun story over from The Guardian where a software development company, or a software engineer rather, set up a company formerly known as double quote greater than sign less than sign script source equals and then a web address limited, which for anyone who's familiar with JavaScript and HTML, that is a textbook example of a XXS payload, cross-site scripting payload. The company was legally named this, and it was legally allowed because all of those characters were legal characters to have as a company identifier, but they have been forced to change their name. What do you think about this, Troy?
Yeah, and they changed the name to that company whose name used to contain HTML script tags limited, which is quite funny. All caps. Yeah, it's it's just really funny what people will try and do with putting code where it doesn't belong.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. It's that
right. Like those
funny.
those videos of people who will put like SQL injection commands on their license plates, so when they get tagged by a red light camera, it will delete that entry from the table, or it'll drop that table.
Well, I mean, that's the idea.
No, yeah. Used to work. Now it's a bit harder.
Yeah. So it mentioned in the article that similar company names have been registered in the past, one of which was an SQL injection type name, like a semicolon drop table companies limited. But I was really interested actually about this quote at the very end of the article. It says, a company's house spokesperson said a company was registered using characters that could have presented a security risk to a small number of our customers if published on unprotected external websites. We have taken immediate steps to mitigate this risk and have put measures in place to prevent a similar occurrence. We are confident that company's house services remain secure. And I just find it absolutely hilarious that they decided that naming your company this with legal characters to name your company was a security risk. And therefore, it's not the onus of the unsecured website owners to secure their website to support this name. But no, it's the responsibility of the person behind this company to literally change their name.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure what the...
that just seems backwards.
I'm not sure what the, legal underbelly of this whole thing is, right? Because if Companies House is providing like a database of businesses that other customers can like access, right, for the information to do whatever with, what agreements have been made and what liabilities there are and stuff.
I'll have to ask someone from the UK.
Yeah, so any of you UK listeners out there,
yeah.
email in to.
Oh yes, please. I always look forward to that. You can. Let's see. I guess if you wanted to email, you could send an email to info@geeklaunch.net. I don't have an email set up for the podcast specifically yet, but yep. All right, that's it for that little fun story. And then the last one we're going to cover today is this blog post from Sneak.Berlin. It's entitled "Your Computer Isn't Yours," and it pretty much is talking about something that happened a couple weeks ago with Apple computers, where they just wouldn't launch any applications. So Troy, do you want to go get into a little bit about why this was happening?
Sure. So basically, what Mac iOS has been doing that caused this is it will update Apple with every application you launch with its like application hash, which is a unique identifier to that application. And usually, up until that point, it was always fast enough and discreet enough to where nobody would notice. But apparently, when that happened, the server was quite slow and it wasn't fast enough, and so everybody's apps failed to open because of this tracking of your data.
Yeah. So pretty much your Mac was relying on these Apple servers to return back fast enough that they could still open the application without anybody noticing. And to me, like, the simple solution to this problem, like from Apple's perspective, and make this less noticeable too, would just be have that telemetry request, I suppose you'd call it, be sent out asynchronously. So the application launches and you send out the request, but you don't wait for it to come back before you launch the application.
Well,
right?
The problem with that is their Apple's quote unquote reason for doing this is so that they can check to see if an application you're trying to launch might be a security risk, right? That's their whole it's about security, right?
Yeah.
For them. And so in that case, they couldn't let the app start before getting back with whether or not it's a security risk, because
That's true.
if it was, then oops.
We already let it begin. Yeah. So okay, I hear that, but also it does say that it fails silently if you're offline, which and if it fails silently, that means they're not warning you. So it's not like Apple's going to pop up and say you're offline. We can't check to make sure this executable isn't malicious. It just fails silently.
Yeah, it's kind of like the HTTP issue that we covered a week or two ago, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, it would just downgrade
Firefox
silently or upgrade silently, whichever it can access easiest.
But yeah, so that's what I think would cause a lot of people to kind of raise an eyebrow at this, like this blog poster did.
Yeah, well, what do you know? Yet another case of, well, is this convenience trumping security, or is this just trumping security?
Security trumping security.
Security trumping security.
Whose security
security
is
trumping privacy, maybe?
Yeah. Well, because and like Apple's announced afterwards that it's like in response to the people being like, hey, what is up with this? They're like deleting the IP logs, encrypting communication between macOS and Apple, and giving users an option of disabling the online checks, which solves some of the problems. There's still other problems to where there's other communications that aren't being encrypted. Like I think there's something about your iMessages being backed up to Apple's cloud and that not being encrypted or like going with the key, and so anybody could decrypt them. And also, these like the option for like disabling these online checks, right? Like a lot of those types of settings are very hard for people to find, and people just usually don't even know about them.
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with Macs, but I know that obviously Windows 10 is known for spying on people, and I've seen entire guides, like pages long blog posts of how to stop your Windows 10 from phoning home, and you have to go into all these different settings and edit registry keys and control panel and all this different stuff. It's a whole deal.
Yeah, and this is kind of a wider spread issue of, do you own the technology that you're using, right? Because yes, you own the physical hardware, but what about the software, right? Because that's still getting like updates from the company, right? It's like, okay, well, do you purchase every update, right? Because that keeps your computer like secure against like threats that come up, right? Or but since you don't, it's there's something with I remember something with Tesla, with their new cars, because they have like a whole OS, right? And they like have their self-driving things and everything, and they would they had this plan to have like this like base, right? And then people would be able to like purchase like additional add-ons to the software, if I remember correctly, right? So
Really?
like all of the capability of the car is in there, but some of it is locked away when you purchase it so that you can buy it later.
Yes, I'm subscribed to the car that I bought.
Yeah, right? And so it's with the there's hardware and there's software, right? And because they both require each other, right? But while you have the physical hardware, the software can be accessed by these companies because they made it, and there's so much under the hood, and I mean, you can't turn it off, right? And you're only limited to what is available. And so it's a big question.
Yeah. Well, on that note, why don't we move into our discussion topic for today? So we're going to depart from the news stories of the day and just talk more generally about operating systems and the question of like privacy versus usability and security and all that. And obviously we all know that there's the two main contenders on the market. There's Windows and there's Mac, and some of you may know that there's Linux as well, which is often brought up as a possibly viable third alternative to the traditional, pair of ever-warring operating system competitors. But yeah, as a programmer, Troy, if you could just have your pick of whatever operating system you want, what would you just use by default?
Well, that's a difficult question. Very, very, very complex question you just asked me, Jacob, because it really, number one, it really depends on who you are and what you're using it for. And number two, so the operating systems that I've used mostly are Windows and Linux, right? Windows for my personal machines mostly, and then Linux mostly at work, and then I will also use the Linux subsystem that's built into Windows as well.
Yeah, I use that all the time.
Yeah, it's great. I love it. One of the best parts of Windows is Linux.
Linux.
But anyway, so to me, number one, I guess like I'm very cognizant of like things are collecting my data all the time, right? And like security and things like that. I personally haven't really done a whole lot to combat that. I definitely not as like active against that as like I expect you are, just from our previous conversations. And so for me personally, I'm perfectly fine using Windows, mostly because it has the support and the capabilities that Linux doesn't. So basically, just to take an example, right? Like video games, right?
Oh yeah, that's a big one.
Almost any, like, it's PC gamers, right? And PC implies Windows, right? Windows by far has the biggest like game libraries. Just about any game you can play on a computer you can play on Windows, right?
What are you telling me? You don't game on your MacBook?
If I had one, I probably wouldn't. But yeah, but then like Mac
running Crysis on your paper thin laptop.
Yeah, well, Mac and Linux don't have as much support, and like I believe there is a Steam client on Linux, but I don't believe you can run all the games on Steam on Linux, right? So that immediately, if you want a computer for gaming, you pretty much always get Windows, right? And there's not a whole lot of other choice just because of the availability of games you can play. Now, if you know that the only games that you want to play are all available on Linux, then I mean, go for it. But yeah, and then also for me, there's some good releases of Linux out there, right, that are pretty well polished, and that are pretty well put together, but none of them have the support or the backing that like Windows does. Yeah. Right, like Windows has huge development teams working on it constantly, and like sometimes they mess up Windows 8 but
Vista.
Yeah, well, that was too long ago, Jacob. Most of the listeners don't know what Vista was.
Keep going back.
but anyway, and so from a security standpoint, that's good, right? Because it can respond overall quicker to security risks. Right. Now, I will say Windows is a bit bloated, so they probably have more security risks than Linux, honestly. I don't have anything to back that up. That's just my guess. But, yeah, so I do really like Linux as a development platform. Right. If I'm doing programming, I want to do it on Linux.
Yeah, definitely, same.
Right. But if I'm gaming, I want to use Windows. Right. If I'm, doing normal everyday stuff, right, like changing a Word document or looking at my email, it doesn't really matter. And so I haven't talked about
Chromebook.
Yeah, sorry for rambling. You haven't gotten many words in edgewise, but I haven't said anything about Mac, and that's because number one, I have barely used Macs, and number two, I'm sure there's great things about Macs and Apple. I personally have stayed away because I know I have seen the kind of like Apple vacuum that happens, right? Because Apple has designed all of their devices to work together and only with each other, right? So once you get one Apple device, the only way to like improve the technology around you is to get more Apple devices.
Yeah. I mean, they all work together, but the problem is they only work together, more or less.
Yeah, so it's a great business strategy. Because it sounds good for your customers, and then once you get new customers, they're hooked in, right? Because it's so difficult to get out of it and have the same ease of functionality in your life. So that's the primary reason why I've stayed away from Mac.
Yeah, like who has an Apple Watch and then they go and run around with their, HP laptop.
Exactly.
Right. So yeah, that's been one of the big things for me as well that's kept me away from Apple is, well, first of all, there's the premium tax because Apple products are seen as for the elite, and so they jack up the price a little bit. Not saying they're not good devices. They're definitely good quality devices, but yeah, it's the whole suck of the Apple ecosystem. If you're in one, you kind of have to, or you want to be in them all. And then as far as Windows versus Linux goes, yeah, the two biggest areas that I've noticed that, or at least the areas that I use, like the different types of software that I use on my computer that are lacking in Linux that are present on Windows are the media production. So basically the Adobe Suite. Yep. And then, like you mentioned before, games, but like totally the media production software that's available for Windows just blows everything that's available for Linux out of the water, with the possible exception of Blender. Blender is kind of like that gold nugget of media production software that is available on Linux. But like the Adobe Suite, kind of the gold standard for just about every single piece of media production you could think of, Adobe Photoshop, Premiere Pro, After Effects, Audition. They cover basically video, audio, images, and the whole 9 yards. They have tons and tons of different applications, and lots of them are only available for Windows and Mac. So those are, I really don't see myself anytime in the future not having a Windows box. But I could see myself always only having one Windows box and having the rest be Linux, because it's so much easier to use, so much better for privacy. You really control everything that your computer knows about you, everything that it's doing, who it's contacting behind your back.
Yeah.
And it's just great for programming.
So, but yeah, and so
and the games on Linux are getting better, but yeah, they're still not there. They're still not there.
Yeah. A couple things. Number one of the big things for Apple, somebody who would want to get a Mac is Apple is by far the premium in music production, right? I don't think any artist uses anything other than a Mac to produce music, because the state of the art software to do that is supported on Apple. And so that's just Logic. Another example of what suits your needs, right? And I'll say, for me, right, Windows with a Linux subsystem works great, because I can use the subsystem for any developing I need to do or things like that. And I also have Windows. Eventually I would like to get a separate Linux machine. I'm just not at that point yet. But I think the big thing of if we're talking Windows and Mac versus Linux is what you said, where on Linux you have a lot more control over how your computer runs, even, and the security and who it's contacting and stuff. However, that comes with the burden of required knowledge, right? How to do all that stuff on Linux, whereas a lot of people don't, and they don't want to learn how to do that because they don't care about that. Now, we could have the discussion of if they should be caring about that privacy, right? Which both of us would say, yes, you should, but it takes a lot of learning and knowledge and doing to actually care about it, right? Like you said, that one Windows security step-by-step guide was pages and pages long, right? And so for most of the general populace, Mac and Windows, they like having all of that hidden away from them because they just don't want to deal with it, and they are content in their ignorance. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, right? If you don't care about that part of your technology, that's perfectly fine, right? But I think at the very least it's important to know that that's the choice you're making.
Yeah, it's really that struggle between it's of trying to get someone to care about something that they have probably never seen or experienced and don't know is affecting them in a bad way, right?
Yeah.
We're fighting an uphill battle because the data collection companies have successfully integrated their services, so to speak, into so many aspects of our everyday digital lives that you don't even notice they're there most of the time, and so people just don't care.
Yeah. Well, and and the sad thing is that the best way to confront this problem is to just make people aware of it and have people act accordingly, because it's not going to stop, right? These companies are making most of their profits off of selling data, right? They sell the machine that you're using, sure, but is that the majority of their profits? No.
Yeah, probably not. Well, good things to keep in mind. All right. I think that'll probably wrap up that portion of this conversation and also this episode of the Compulang podcast. I'd like to thank all of y'all so much for spending this last half hour with us. Thank you, Troy, for joining me in this conversation, talking about security, privacy, and operating systems.
Always a pleasure, Jacob.
Yeah. And I guess we will talk at y'all next week. Thank you so much for tuning in. Goodbye.